December 20th, 1943. 25,000 feet over Germany. The air temperature outside the cockpit was 55 degrees below zero, and the lead bomber in the American formation, a B-17 Flying Fortress, was dying. Its nose was blown off. The pilot, 21-year-old Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown, was fighting to hold the controls, barely conscious. The tail was shredded by flak. The top turret gunner was dead, frozen solid over his weapon. 3 other crewmen were wounded and bleeding out on the cold metal floor. The plane itself looked like chewed aluminum foil. This B-17, named Year Older Pub, had just completed a suicidal bombing run over Bremen and was trying to limp 300 miles home to England. They were alone, losing altitude and leaving a thick black oil slick across the sky that might as well have been a road map for every German fighter pilot. And then the Hunter appeared. Out of the scattered clouds came a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the most dangerous interceptor in the German fleet. At the controls was one of the last true gentlemen of the Luftwaffe, Lieutenant Franz Stiegler. Stiegler was an ace with 27 victories and only 4 more kills needed to earn the highest German military honor, the Knight's Cross. He was a professional killer, trained to hate every enemy bomber as a threat to his homeland. He positioned his fighter for the final clean kill. This was an easy shot. The American plane was a wreck, incapable of fighting back. This kill would bring him glory, but Franz Stiegler looked closer. He looked past the sight of his gun and saw the humanity inside the wreckage. Before we dive into the most incredible act of mercy in World War II history, if you value stories of honor and courage that defy the brutality of war, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories of human choice to light. What happened next was an act of insubordination so profound, so dangerous, that it defied the direct orders of the Führer himself. You are about to discover why this German ace put his career, his life, and his family at risk, and why the incredible story of this encounter was buried and classified by the American government for nearly 40 years. The B-17 was designed to be a flying fortress, capable of absorbing enormous punishment, but the attack over Bremen had been ferocious. The plane was hit first by flak, a sudden, blinding detonation that instantly killed the tail gunner and shattered the control cables for the rudder. The B-17 instantly yawed violently, almost tearing itself out of the sky. Brown, a young man from western West Virginia, flew straight into a massive formation of enemy fighters. His crew fought back, emptying their guns into the German interceptors. But the enemy overwhelmed them. One burst of fire, cannon shells and machine gun rounds raked the length of the bomber's fuselage. The fire destroyed the oxygen system, sending shrapnel into Brown's head and turning the cockpit instantly cold. The most terrifying damage was in the waist section. The explosion tore a hole so large that the aluminum skin was peeled back like a banana peel. Inside, the temperature dropped to lethal levels, and the wind screamed with the force of a hurricane. Blood instantly flash-froze to the floor plates. The smell inside was a mix of leaking aviation fuel, burnt gunpowder, ozone from the high altitude, and the metallic, coppery scent of blood. The radio was mostly useless, the hydraulics were shot, and the flaps were frozen. The only thing working reliably was the autopilot trim tab, which Brown was using to steer the bomber with excruciating slowness, leveraging all his strength against the shattered control yoke. Brown knew the chances of surviving the crossing back to England were virtually zero. They were alone, losing altitude, and the moment they dropped low enough to encounter ground fire, the B-17 was finished. Meanwhile, Franz Stiegler had his own demons. He had been shot down and wounded 4 times in the last year. He had seen too many friends die, and his field training was a constant, desperate battle. He wasn't fueled by patriotism anymore, but by revenge for the constant bombardment of German cities. He had just witnessed the destruction of a factory and the slaughter of civilians, including women and children. Every fiber of his being screamed for the destruction of the aircraft that had done it. Stiegler's descent toward the B-17 was tactical, professional, and lethal. He knew exactly where to aim: the engines, the fuel tanks, or the cockpit. A true ace always went for the decisive shot. But as he approached, the scene inside the American bomber registered not as a military target, but as a violation of his deepest principles. Stigler saw the sheer desperation. He saw the empty gun barrels, frozen and useless. He saw the hole in the nose where the life support systems were destroyed. He saw the pilot, not arrogant or proud, but young, bleeding and terrified. The bomber was a coffin that hadn't closed its lid yet. The sight of the dead turret gunner, slumped over his weapon and covered in frost, solidified Stigler's moral crisis. Shooting the B-17 now would not be a kill, it would be an execution. It would violate the code of chivalry instilled in him by his mentor, Gustav Rodel. You are pilots, you are hunters, not butchers. Stigler was faced with an impossible choice, one that military history rarely documents: honor versus survival. If he killed the B-17, he got his Knight's Cross. He was a hero. He survived. If he let the B-17 escape, he risked being found out and executed by the Gestapo, under the direct orders of Hitler, who had personally demanded the death of all bomber crews. He tried to signal Brown to land. He gestured towards German territory, waving his hands to indicate a safe landing would mean surrender and medical treatment. Brown mistook this for a psychological trap, believing the German was simply mocking his helpless state before the final humiliating burst. Brown refused. Stigler realized that his survival code was about to be put to the ultimate test. He could not and would not kill these men. He broke the formation. Instead of pulling the trigger, he maneuvered his Bf-109 to the left wingtip of the B-17. This was the most dangerous position for a fighter pilot. By flying wing to wing, he was exposing his vulnerable cockpit to any working American gunner, a huge risk to himself. He used the presence of his powerful Messerschmitt as a shield. He shielded year-old pub from German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground who would hesitate to fire on a formation that included a Luftwaffe fighter. He shielded them from any other German pilot who might stumble upon the crippled bomber. Stigler became, in that moment, the American bomber's guardian angel. The terror on both sides during this period of the escort was palpable. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown and his surviving crew were certain that Stigler was playing a cruel game of cat and mouse, waiting for the perfect moment to execute them over the sea. The wounded men, including the struggling co-pilot, were prepared to die. They watched the black cross of the German plane, their executioner, fly just feet away from them. The roar of the German engine was louder than the sound of their own 4 broken engines. In the cockpit of the Bf-109, Franz Stigler was fighting his conscience and his radar. Every minute he flew, he burned precious fuel, risking not making it back to his own base. Every minute was a violation of his duty. He strained his eyes, scanning the sky for any of his comrades, not to call for help but to avoid them. The tension was broken by a horrifying close call. As they flew over German territory near the coast, Stigler spotted a group of German ground troops. One of the soldiers, recognizing the B-17 as an enemy, raised his rifle to fire. Stigler immediately tilted his Bf-109 and flew a low, intimidating pass right over the soldier's head, forcing him to duck and preventing the ground fire. Stigler was now actively using military force against his own people to protect his enemy. Finally, the North Sea appeared below, its grey, cold expanse promising safety and neutrality. Stigler knew the B-17 was barely clinging to life, but if it could reach the safety of the British coast, it might survive. He brought his Messerschmitt into a final, deliberate position. He pulled up to the side of the B-17 and, looking directly at Charlie Brown through the shattered glass, gave a sharp, definitive salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, of a job honorably done, and of farewell. Then Franz Stigler broke away. He pulled his Bf-109 into a sharp bank and sped back towards German territory. He never looked back. He watched only as the shattered B-17 slowly vanished into the thick protective cloud cover over the water. Stigler flew his nearly empty Messerschmitt back to the German airfield. He landed with only 2 liters of fuel remaining, enough for perhaps 2 minutes of flight. When questioned by his ground crew about the missing B-17 kill, Stigler lied. He claimed to have shot the bomber down over the sea, securing the victory he needed for the Knight's Cross. He knew the cost of the truth: execution. Meanwhile, Charles Brown miraculously piloted his shattered bomber back to England. The plane flew on fumes and willpower, landing safely at a remote RAF base. The British ground crew counted over 2,000 bullet and flak holes. Brown immediately reported the German pilot's bizarre, protective escort, describing the silent, watchful guardian who let them live. The American commanders listened to Brown's detailed testimony and reviewed the surviving gun camera footage, which indeed showed Stigler's Bf-109 flying wing to wing with the disabled bomber. The military was faced with a dilemma. They could not allow news to spread that a German pilot had shown an act of chivalry and mercy. The war machine required the enemy to be seen as purely evil. The U.S. military immediately ordered Brown and his surviving crew to never speak of the incident again. The event was classified top secret. For nearly 40 years, Charles Brown kept his promise. He never spoke of the German pilot who saved his life, and Franz Stigler, now living in Canada, kept his secret, believing the young American pilot had died over the sea. The psychological toll on both men was immense. Brown, now a successful businessman, carried the debt of the man he couldn't thank. Stigler lived under the shadow of his silent disobedience, wondering if the men he spared had survived the rest of the war. In 1986, Charles Brown decided the secret was too big to keep. He began a personal quest to find the German pilot who saved his life. He spent years writing letters, placing ads in military publications, searching for the man with the Messerschmitt who tipped his wings and let them go. In 1990, Charles Brown received a letter from Canada. It read, "To Charles Brown, I was the one. I know why you were not shot down over the North Sea, because you were not just a machine, but men in a dying plane. I saw my chance to save you." The two men met that year in the United States. They didn't shake hands, they embraced. Stigler looked at Brown and said, "I have been searching for you for 40 years. I am glad you made it home." They became more than friends. They became family. They spent the last decades of their lives sharing their incredible story, finally revealing the truth that proved that even in the most brutal of wars, honor, moral choice, and the simple act of human mercy can pierce the fog of war. Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, and Charles Brown followed him 6 months later. The story of the German ace who refused to kill the American pilot remains one of the greatest testaments to the unbreakable code of human honor. It is a story not about the planes, but about the men inside them, and the ultimate battlefield that exists not in the sky, but in the human heart. They proved that the most extraordinary act of courage is not always found in fighting, but in choosing not to. This is the truth the generals kept secret, and it is a truth that defines humanity itself.